Morning, friends. Finishing up Chapter 5. At the end of December, news reached Tehran from the Arabian-American oil company known as Aramco. Had reached a new deal with Saudi Arabia under which it would share its profits with the Saudis on a 50-50 basis. Ambassador Shepard immediately dispatched a cable to London urging that Anglo-Iranian might make a similar offer to Iran. Both the Foreign Office and the oil company rejected the idea. By doing so, they lost another chance to resolve the looming crisis before disaster struck. Anglo-Iranian's manager in Tehran, E.G.D. Northcroft, advised the Home Office not to attach much importance to the nationalist movement. The British position was so far removed from reality that Northrop's assistant, Mostafa Fateh, the company's highest-ranking Iranian employee and for decades its faithful servant, felt compelled to protest. He wrote an impassioned 23-page letter to the member of Anglo-Iranian's board of directors, Edward Elkington, whom he had known when Elkington was posted in Iran. The letter was an eloquent warning that the company needed to recognize the awakening nationalism and political consciousness of the people of Asia, and show breadth of vision, tolerance for other people's views, and clear thinking to avoid disaster. It described Anglo-Iranian's alliance with corrupt ruling classes and leech-like bureaucracies as disastrous, outdated, and impractical. Fateh said there was still enough support in the Majlis to ratify the supplemental agreement if the company would revise it to include a 50-50 profit share and shorten its term. Otherwise, the agreement was doomed, since the company's policies had alienated the liberal and progressive classes from Britain. His eloquent cri de coeur went unheeded. Fateh is not to be trusted far, sniffed one British diplomat to whom Elkington showed it. Confrontation now seemed inevitable. The prospect thrilled Iranian nationalists who believed that history was finally giving them a chance to pull their country out from under the rule of British imperialists. In January 1951, they called a rally to launch a mass-based campaign aimed at forcing the nationalization of Anglo-Iranian. A huge crowd turned out. The first speakers were from the National Front, and they were duly cheered as they laid out their case. That was just the beginning. After the politicians were finished, a succession of mullahs came to the podium to proclaim that every good Muslim had a sacred duty to support nationalization. The last of them read a fatwa, asserting that from his place in paradise, the Prophet Muhammad himself had condemned the Razmara government for selling Iran's birthright to infidel foreigners. Neither the secularists of the National Front nor the religious fundamentalists who followed Ayatollah Khamenei were comfortable in alliance with each other, but they put aside their very deep differences in the interest of the great cause. Poor Razmara was now in an impossible position. Masses had long since decided that he was at best a pawn of the British and at worst a traitor. He replied by insisting time and again that protesters, both inside the Majlis and outside, were pursuing a mad dream, and that the country's interests required it to make a deal with the British. But although he worked feverishly to salvage the British position, neither Anglo-Iranian nor the Foreign Officer gave him a shred of support. Ambassador Shepard went so far as to send him a letter advising him to take a strong line against ingrates who did not appreciate the immense service to mankind of the British people in recent times. Razmara soldiered bravely on. On March 3rd, he appeared before Mossadegh's oil committee and once again explained his opposition to the idea of nationalization. He said it would be illegal, would drive the British to unpredictable retaliation, and would devastate Iran's economy. That night, Ambassador Shepard cabled home that he himself had written the gist of Razmara's speech. Iranians suspected as much and reacted with another outburst of protest. At a mass rally on March 7th, calls for nationalization were replaced with chants of death to the British. Razmara was out of time. Even the Shah knew it. Quietly, he had begun asking politicians of various stripes whom they would suggest as a new prime minister. Each gave the same answer: Mossadegh. Everyone recognized that Razmara's days were numbered, but few anticipated how violently his career would end. On the same day that thousands of demonstrators gathered in Tehran to shout their hatred for Britain, Razmara and a friend of the Shah named Asadollah Alam drove to a Tehran mosque for the funeral of a religious leader. A young man with a pistol stepped from the crowd and fired. Razmara fell dead. Police officers seized the gunman, a carpenter named Khalil Tamasivi, who was a member of a religious terror group called Fedayeen-Islam. I have rendered a humble service, he told interrogators, it was for the Almighty in order to deliver the deprived Muslim people of Iran from foreign serfdom. Circumstances of Razmar's assassination were never clarified. Evidence emerged to suggest that the fatal shot had been fired not by Tahmasib, but by a soldier acting on behalf of the Shah or members of his inner circle, and that Azadollah Alam had knowingly driven him to his fateful rendezvous. Years later, a retired Iranian colonel wrote in his memoir that the fatal shot had come from a Colt revolver, available only to soldiers. An army sergeant in civilian clothes was chosen for the deed, he asserted. He had been told to shoot and kill Razmar with a Colt. The moment Tahmasib began to shoot, those who had examined the wounds in Razmar's body were in no doubt that he had been killed by a Colt bullet, not by the bullet of a weak gun. Razmar had represented the last hope of conciliation. His cause was all but lost even before his assassination, and the day after the fatal shots were fired, Mossadegh's oil committee took the fateful step toward which it had been marching. By unanimous vote, it recommended that the Majlis nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The next day, thousands of people gathered at a festive rally to hear Ayatollah Khamenei applaud the committee vote and demand that the Majlis act quickly. No public figure could now oppose nationalization without fear of provoking the ire of the masses or worse. Even the newly named Prime Minister Hussein Allah, a British-educated diplomat who understood the difficulties that nationalization was sure to bring, dared not speak against it. At the British Embassy, Ambassador Shepherd still believed that he had a chance to hold back the flood. He launched a campaign to persuade Majlis members to stay home on the day of the nationalization vote, thereby preventing a quorum. First, he sent a message to the Shah urging him to use all his influence with monarchist and conservative deputies. Then he met the Prime Minister, Allah, and informed him curtly that the company's operations cannot be legally terminated by an action such as nationalization. He suggested for the first time, though, that Anglo-Iranian might now be ready to consider the idea of a 50-50 profit split. A 50-50 arrangement might have been accepted a little while ago, Allah replied, but now something more would be required. The Majlis met on March 15th to cast its historic vote. 96 deputies turned up, including several who had promised the Shah they would stay away. Everyone voted in favor of nationalization. 5 days later, the largely ceremonial Senate, which had come into existence only a few years earlier, and half of whose members were appointed by the Shah, also voted its unanimous approval. Mossadegh was now a hero of epic proportions. Unable even to step onto the streets without being mobbed by admirers, tribal leaders in the hinterlands celebrated his triumph. Ayatollah Khamenei lionized him as a liberator on the scale of Cyrus and Darius, and even the communists of Tuda embraced him. Over the next few weeks, the Majlis voted overwhelmingly for every bill he presented. He was so clearly the man of the moment that Prime Minister Allah found no reason to remain in office, and in mid-April he resigned. The British government, however, had no intention of surrendering. Its resolve was stiffened when Foreign Secretary Bevan, who had shown some sympathy for the Iranian position, resigned for health reasons, and was replaced by the colossally unprepared Herbert Morrison. Morrison had spent 30 years working his way up through Labour Party ranks, and had never claimed expertise in world affairs. His proudest achievements were building a new Waterloo Bridge and reorganizing London's transit system. He considered the challenge from Iran a simple matter of ignorant natives rebelling against the forces of civilization. In one of his first public statements as Foreign Secretary, he urged that British troops be moved toward Iran and stand ready if necessary to intervene in Persian oil fields. At Morrison's urging, top-level policymakers from the Foreign Office, the Admiralty, the Bank of England, and the Ministry of Fuel and Power joined to form a working party on Persia. It commissioned several studies to use as background in dealing with the crisis, including one on the psychology of Iranians. The author, a British diplomat, asserted that the typical Iranian was motivated by an unabashed dishonesty, fatalistic outlook, and indifference to suffering. The ordinary Persian is vain, unprincipled, eager to promise that he knows he is incapable or has no intention of performing, wedded to procrastination, lacking in perseverance and energy, but amenable to discipline. Above all, he enjoys intrigue and readily turns to prevarication and dishonesty whenever there is a possibility of personal gain. Although an accomplished liar, he does not expect to be believed. They easily acquire a superficial knowledge of technical subjects, deluding themselves into the belief that it is profound. What a dick. To deal with such people on an equal or respectful basis would, of course, be absurd. Instead, the Foreign Office devised a three-pronged strategy to bring them back under control. First, Mohammad Reza Shah would be persuaded to dissolve the Majlis. Second, he would appoint Said Zia, the aging British favorite, who had helped Reza Shah come to power 30 years earlier as Prime Minister. Third, the Truman administration in Washington should be urged at least not to indicate any disagreement or divergence from our point of view. As this policy was being formulated, Anglo-Iranian decided to prove its resolve by reducing the living allowances it paid to Iranian workers. Thousands walked off the job in protest. Soon afterwards, the British began sending warships to the waters of Abadan. By mid-April, 3 frigates and 2 cruisers were lurking within sight of the refinery. This raised tensions even higher. Oil workers poured defiantly into the dusty streets, and a series of brawls left 6 Iranians, 2 British oil workers, and a British sailor dead. Some Iranians concluded that the British had embarked on a deliberate campaign of provocation in order to provide a pretext for military intervention. Ambassador Shepherd believed he could bring the situation back under control if Iran had a new and more decisively pro-British Prime Minister. He insisted that the Shah nominate Said Zia, and the Shah dutifully agreed. The Majlis scheduled a vote on his nomination on April 28th. That morning, Shepherd issued a statement asserting that His Majesty's government would not negotiate anything under the threat of nationalization. With this show of strength and his friend Said Zia at the head of government, he calculated events would begin moving in a different direction. It was a highly unrealistic scenario, and showed once again how completely the British had misjudged Iran's mood. Not even the most fervent nationalist, however, could have predicted what happened when the Majlis assembled to debate Said Zia's nomination. All eyes were, of course, on Mossadegh, the hero of the hour. Everyone expected him to lead the opposition with one of his withering tirades against the British and their traitorous errand boys. But when the speaker asked who wished to begin the debate, Mossadegh sat quietly and expressionless. A prominent right-wing deputy named Jamal Imami, who was on the British payroll, took the floor instead. Imami did not even mention Said Zia. Instead, he launched into a bitter attack on Mossadegh, pillorying him for having plunged the Majlis into immobility and paralyzed the country with his constant carping. If the old man wanted a real challenge, Imami said scornfully, he should try being Prime Minister himself and seeing how difficult the job was. Mossadegh had several times turned aside suggestions that he take over the government, and Imami said he knew the reason why. Mossadegh was one of the most irresponsible windbags who delight in making speeches about how wrong everyone else is, but never offer anything positive. The chamber fell silent as Imami finished. Mossadegh waited for a long moment, and then rose to his feet. Speaking slowly and deliberately, he said that he was honored and grateful for the suggestion that he become Prime Minister, and would, in all humility, accept. Everyone was stunned, Imami most of all. Soon the shock turned to a pandemonium. A formal motion was made that Mossadegh be named Prime Minister, and the Speaker called for an immediate vote. It passed by a margin of 79 to 12. Sensing the power he held at that moment, Mossadegh said that he would serve as Prime Minister only if the Majlis also voted to approve an act he had drawn up to implement the nationalization of Anglo-Iranian. Under its provisions, a parliamentary committee would audit Anglo-Iranian books, weigh the claims of both sides for compensation, begin sending Iranians abroad to learn the skills of running an oil industry, and draw up articles of incorporation for a new national Iranian oil company. The Majlis approved it unanimously that very afternoon. The unthinkable had now happened. Mossadegh, the symbol of Iranian nationalism and resistance to royal power, had suddenly arrived at the pinnacle of power. It was a moment of exhilaration, but also of profound uncertainty. Everyone understood that a clash of titans was approaching. No one dared to guess what it might mean for Iran and the rest of the world. Plot twist. Have a good day, friends.